Good morning. Happy Father's Day. Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. I am Anita, and I use the pronouns she and her, and I am today's worship associate. Whoever you are, whomever you love, whatever your image of the holy, wherever you are in your life's journey, you're welcome here. If this is your first time with us, we'd love to get to know you, so please sign our guest book in the foyer. And for kids in our service, we have an activity table up here. Kids can stay seated with their grown-ups if they wish. Please remember to use your whisper voice. If you would like to know more about our programs for youth and kids, please speak to Elizabeth Portillos, our Director of Faith Formation. We also have a nursery down the hall for younger kiddos, and Sarah Hamoud, our nursery coordinator, can check them in. We have our candles of community over here and in the back. You are encouraged to come up before the prayer meditation time to light a candle and or write your joy or sorrow in the book to be read aloud. If you need pastoral care or support, a chat over coffee, or even financial assistance, please contact Reverend Tina DeYoe to set up an appointment. She is back in the office on Tuesday of this next week. We come together as a community every Sunday to pause and worship together. Worship creates connections within, among, and beyond us, calling us to live with wisdom and compassion, calling us to be our better selves. Today we have James Carroll as our guest speaker. Thank you, James, for being here with us today. I will now read our chalice lighting words, and I think we have somebody who's coming up here. Yeah. Okay, Lacey wanted us to know she went to camp. There was lots of bugs. She didn't get bit, and she had a great time. The light between wonder and wisdom. We light this chalice in honor of two ancient human callings, the callings to understand and the calling of transformation. Science teaches us to ask and to marvel at a universe more intricate than we can ever imagine. Spirit asks us to listen and discover that we are not separate from the mystery of life. One explores the laws of the cosmos, the other helps us find our place within it. Neither one diminishes the other. May this flame remind us that truth has many expressions, the language of equations and the language of silence, the language of evidence and the language of compassion. May this light guide our inquiry, deepen our compassion, and kindle in us an enduring sense of awe.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Whoever you are, whatever you believe or don't believe, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll. I'm a religious education instructor at the Unitarian Church, and I used to say I teach a class on the fourth Sunday on comparative religion, religious studies, and occasionally the Bible, and I would alternate between some of those three subjects. I haven't done that in a long time, and when I do it, it's been rather spotty with a lot of misses. Some of you know my father's been fairly sick, and I've been in Utah taking care of him a lot on the weekends, and it's caused me to miss a lot of classes. He passed away last month, and so that means a couple things. One, it means hopefully I'll be here more often, but it also means obviously that I miss him. And my father was a scientist. He never finished his PhD, but he's one of those people we call an ABD, all but dissertation, chemist. And he never finished his PhD because GE really wanted him to come work on their nuclear reactors, and they told him to come, and they didn't care that he hadn't finished yet, and they wanted him now. And for a while, he was in charge of building some of the reactors in Japan, and later in the U.S., he built wind turbines, and was one of the first people to actually make wind power feasible in a way that actually made it produce an economic return. I was always very proud of my father, and I wanted to be just like him. So when I grew up, I decided I was going to be a scientist. And then I went on a mission for the LDS Church, and I decided the problem with science is it helps us do things. It gives us more power, but it doesn't always tell us what to do with the things we can now do. It doesn't tell us how to become, better, more moral people. So I doubled down on religion, and I decided I was going to teach religion at the university when I graduated. And so I took both science courses and religion courses, and I taught religion, specifically comparative religion, the Bible, and some LDS scriptures like the Book of Mormon, Pearl Great Price at the university to pay my way through grad school. I had what was called at the time a crisis of faith, and I decided I no longer believed in the church I'd grown up with. Some of that was ethical, their opposition to LGBT rights, but some of it was historical, theological. I decided I really was a universalist. If there was a God, he probably saved everybody. I didn't believe this whole burning stuff, and Mormonism is well known for being universalist adjacent. Everyone but the sons of perdition are saved, but it's kind of a restorationist universalism, right? Where everyone's saved after you suffer. You suffer for your sins, and then everyone is saved, which is actually some of the earliest universalist teachings in the U.S. were restorationist universalism. In fact, Joseph Smith's father was in the congregation of Hosea Ballou, one of the founders of our universalist belief. But in any event, I decided that the LDS theology wasn't universalist enough for me. I believed God was more merciful than was taught in that theology, and so I wound up a scientist working at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I also wound up here in this Unitarian congregation, Universalist congregation. That sort of matters for why I have a background both in religion and also in science. And as sort of a scientist, my feeling was to apply what I knew of science to my newfound belief in and love of religion. And so I not only did I study my own religion, but this became a spiritual practice for me. So for me, the way I worshiped was I studied. I read my scriptures, I studied the history, I studied the ancient Near East. I got a minor in ancient Near Eastern history, and I studied deeply the texts of my religion and the texts of other religions. In any event, that raised the question, can you use science to study religion? And I don't mean to decide if there's a God. The argument about whether there's a God in the scientific debate, usually we see this framed as a debate between science and religion, where scientists and religious people argue about whether there's a God or what you should believe or shouldn't believe. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about religion is something people do. Can we use science to learn more about what people do, to compare religions, to find commonalities, and to figure out what religion tells us about what it means to be human? If you're interested, normally my talks in services are more devotional, and my talks at my fourth Sunday classes are more intellectual. I apologize, but this one is going to end up being like one of my fourth Sunday religious education lectures. If that interests you, I encourage you to come. I don't think we're going to be doing it next week. I think because I'm giving the sermon, we probably won't do that. Preparing one of these a month is about all my time investment can handle. But the following month, assuming it doesn't hit vacations and things, I'm going to be doing this again, and the topic is actually, I think, going to be William James and pragmatism, one of the early founders of one aspect of religious studies, which we'll talk about here. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, and if what I say today strikes some interest, I encourage you to come. So if we're going to talk about how to use science to study religion, we have to kind of figure out what science is. I'm what I call a religious Bayesian, and by that I mean Bayesianism is a religious tenet of mine. And if you don't know what that is, I've got a formula on the board, and that's a great way to make people stop paying attention. So if you don't know what this is, please ignore it, and don't let me lose you. If you don't know what this is, it will maybe explain where I'm coming from. From my perspective, science is all about figuring out how to decide what you should believe. The probability of the theory is true in the presence of evidence, and it's all about how to update that belief in the presence of evidence. And everything else we do, we always talk about things like falsifiability, and when we talk about what science is, you get into these conversations about the scientific method, right? You make a hypothesis and you test the hypothesis, and then all of that is and then you have peer review and published, and all of that is a framework for approximating the Bayesian approach to truth, because the Bayesian approach to truth is the right answer. The problem is humans can't do this. No matter how hard you try, you can't do this. It's computationally infeasible. And so we use the scientific method as a way to get as close to this as we can. So if that's what science is, it's all about figuring out what you should believe in the presence of the evidence you see around you. Well, it's obvious how you would apply that sort of thing to what we call the fundamental laws of nature, right? Quantum mechanics. Everything in the base, everything is quantum mechanics with some connection to gravity that we don't understand, right? But that's everything. Everything is that. And so you can use it to study the fundamental particles of nature and quantum mechanics, and that's standard, what we call hard science. Everyone understands that you can use science to do that, right? It's not controversial. But what happens if you try to study a hurricane? Hurricanes are just quantum mechanics, but if I try to use quantum mechanics to study a hurricane, I don't get very far. Turns out it's really hard to predict how two particles move around, let alone the trillions that make up a hurricane. So instead, we back up and we ask bigger questions. Instead of asking about how all the particles move, we know all those moving particles somehow lead to a hurricane, but we start making bigger theories about things like temperature and water temperature and air pressure and these fluid dynamics, and we make simulations of the fluid dynamics. And so we move to a higher level. We call these effective theories. But what happens if I want to do something like study a human institution like marriage? Can I do that? So I'm building up to this so you can hopefully see where I'm headed. And the answer is obviously people use science to study the institution of marriage all the time. The questions we might ask are a little bit different. We might ask things like, what sorts of people get married? How old do people get married? Why has the age at which people marry changed? Does marriage have an impact on your financial outcome? Which is causal? Do people with higher finances, tend to get married more? Do people who get married more tend to have better financial outcomes? What are the impacts on children? What's the advantage or disadvantage of divorce, depending on whether a couple are getting along? We can ask and answer and try to answer, all of those questions using scientific methods. And I don't think anyone would balk at that, although now we are in something that we would consider a soft science, right? Well, what happens when we try to apply that to religion? Religion as a thing people do, like get married. So what I'm talking about isn't, teaching, I already said this isn't about using science to decide if there's a God. I'm asking the question is, can we figure out what this thing that people do that we call religion is, and can we ask questions about it, and can we use the scientific method to try to answer some of them? If you go to a religious studies campus, you'll often hear the term methodological atheism thrown around. And what they mean by that isn't that, to be in religious studies, you have to be an atheist. In fact, maybe 50-50, I don't know the actual breakdown, of people in religious studies are atheists and the other half are very religious. They ended up where they ended up because they were religious, and so they were interested in religion, so maybe a religious person ends up in religious studies. Or they're an atheist and they can't figure out why these people do these weird things, and so they end up in religious studies, right? So there's kind of this mix of believers and non-believers, but all of them would sort of ascribe, most of them would sort of ascribe what we call methodological atheism. And all that means in this context is I teach, let's see if I got this, I don't. I teach about religion, I don't teach religion. And that's a famous mantra that they all, and it expresses this idea of methodological atheism. It means what I'm teaching has nothing to do with whether there's a God. It means I'm trying to study religion as a thing people do. But can you imagine a mathematician saying, I teach about mathematics, I don't teach mathematics? It's kind of weird, right? But the reason religious studies does this is because religious studies grew out of theology, where people who believed in God were arguing about the details of the Trinity. Right? And they would have, so the intellectual discussion around religion came from within religion at first. And that was theology. Or it was apologetics, where they were defending religion and the reasons you should believe from, the non-believers, or defending Christianity from those heathen, Muslims, and the Muslims were doing the same thing, defending Islam from those heathen Christians, right? That was theology and apologetics. Well, religious studies grew out of that and then eventually sort of divorced itself from that. And so that sort of, I teach about religion, that distance from the subject came about because of its history. And also it's just understandable. I mean, I had a course on religious studies, a lecture, on religious studies that I put online, one of the ones I did here at the church. And the first comment on the video was this guy who said, I named it Religious Scholarship and Literacy, and his first comment was, putting those words together in the same sentence is the epitome of stupidity, or something like that. He had some catchy phrase. The irony, of course, is that religious scholarship and literacy was a phrase coined by Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist. But he was making that point because he was like, if you were intelligent, you wouldn't believe, in other words, right? And you wouldn't therefore, but that wasn't the point of my class. The point of my class was about studying religion as a scientific topic, kind of from the outside in. If you go to a religious studies college in the US today, what you'll find is it doesn't have its own methodology. It tends to borrow methodologies from other subjects. So you'll have an anthropologist, a psychologist, a sociologist, a historian, an archaeologist, an economics, and a political scientist, and maybe a textual critic sitting all next to each other down the hall, but all applying their field to religion. And so religious studies is an application of many different fields to a given topic, rather than its own topic, sort of, in that sense, with its own methodology. And that means there's a wide range of ways you could use, quote, science, the science of history, to study religion. You could use the science of psychology to study religion. If you're going to do that, though, if it's many different disciplines studying a single topic, it would be really good if you could define that topic. The problem is the scholars of religion now universally agree that there is no universally agreed upon definition of religion. In fact, it's the only thing they universally agree upon, is that we can't figure out what the heck this thing religion is. The reason is, of course, there's exceptions to every rule, Unitarian Universalist being one of them. One of my favorite things to do, and I won't necessarily do it, is ask how many people here are atheists. And I usually get one or two hands raised, and then more than one or two often. And yet here you are at church. And so any definition of religion and yet we would consider this a religion, I think, most of us. Is Unitarian Universalist a social club, or are we a religion? We don't certainly have any theology. Love is the doctrine of this church that you have to ascribe to. And so we break half the definitions that people put forward of what a religion is. Buddhism does the same thing, by the way. Confucianism certainly does. Freemasonry is another one that really kind of rocks the boat. The Freemasons insist they're not a religion. The reason they do that is because they want lots of different people from lots of different religions to be able to join their social club without, saying that they've changed religions. You can be a Catholic and be a Mason. You can be a Mormon and be a Mason. You can be a Unitarian Universalist and be a Mason. Fine, but they match almost every definition a scholar might put forth of what a religion is. And so again, there's exceptions to every rule. And this is why religion is so hard to define. I would propose that the answer to this is simple, and it's just that the boundary between what is religion and what is not religion is fuzzy. And so, of course, there are things that sit somewhere in the middle, and they confuse the heck out of us. It's not really that complicated. But there is a little more to it than, although scholars will spend all day and spill thousands of pages of ink trying to solve this problem, it's really not that complicated. But there is some history to it that is worth understanding. And the issue is, if you look at the word religion and really study how it was used in the Middle Ages, for example, you will find that it is used to refer to the institutions of the church. And to join religion is to become a monk or a nun. Religion as a concept that is opposed to the secular. We talk about the separation of church and state, the secular and the religious, and we have those things kind of defined as separate categories. We don't realize this, but that is a modern way of thinking about the world. It's not so much that we invented religion in the modern age, it's that we invented secularism during the Enlightenment, and suddenly we needed a term for something else, the non-secular stuff, and so we invented religion. But religion as a separate concept from the secular is a modern institution. If you go to China, for example, and you ask them, are you on a survey, are you religious? What religion are you? They'll say none of the above. And then you ask them, okay, well, what do you believe and do? And they'll describe Confucianism, or they'll describe Taoism. And you're like, well, you're a Taoist. And they're like, no, I'm not. Part of it is because that's not an identity for them, but the other part of it is that the word for religion in Chinese is superstition. Right? So they're like, I don't belong to a superstition, but I believe everything the Taoists believe, right? And so they don't even have a word that cleanly translates to religion. And it really screws up our surveys when we start surveying Chinese people because they don't answer the way we expect them to. And then we get all confused about what the real population is like in China because we're applying Western concepts to a very different culture. And we don't even realize that this concept of religion is a Western, modern concept. Religion didn't even exist in the ancient world. It was just something that people did along with everything else that people did. And it wasn't its own category. So, okay, we know it's hard to define. We know why, sort of, it's hard to define. But it still feels like at least there's a fuzzy category that we can define as religion. It would be good to study it, right? Because it is interesting. I think it's one of the most interesting things people do in the world. We build pyramids, for heaven's sakes, because of religion. Pyramids are pretty dang cool. We build temples. We go to church on Sunday. We give to the poor. We persecute gay people. Whatever it is we do in the name of religion, we do a lot of very strange and different, and we believe a lot of weird stuff, Zeus and how much is that is metaphorical? How much of the ancient people actually believed it? Where did these myths come from? I mean, this is interesting stuff. Whether or not you believe there is a God out there somewhere, you have to admit that most people believe in some pretty weird stuff, different than your stuff. You may think your stuff is normal and their stuff is weird, but it doesn't matter. We all believe some really strange things in the name of religion, and yet these are fairly rational people. Why is it that rational people believe stuff like this? Where does it come from? What is the motivation? What is the psychology? This is interesting stuff, and so my attempt to sell my class would be, this is one of the most interesting things in the world to me. It's just these strange things that people do. And we hate each other in the name of religion, and we love each other in the name of religion. And we love our enemies as ourselves, and we go to war and shoot them in the name of our religion and the name of our gods. And why do we believe in these gods? Then why do we build some of the most beautiful things humankind has ever built in the name of this? What is it? What is going on? So my selling pitch is that this is interesting stuff. You should come. and find it. And I hope you find it as interesting as I do. And I understand, if you don't, doesn't make you a bad person. We all like different things, and that's okay, right? But I think this is one of the most interesting things in the world you could possibly be interested in. So how do we study religion? Well, people have studied religion a lot of different ways. Like, for example, Karl Marx thought it was the opioid of the masses. But notice they're trying to define it, and then they study it in their writings in light of how they define it. That is one of the things you'll notice as I kind of go through these. Now, I don't have time to go through these in detail, but I've got a long list of some of the early kind of founders of religious studies, as we would think about it, and kind of how they thought about religion. So Karl Marx had a theory. It was the opioid of the masses. Right? It was something the political elite used to... I'm going to do this one in detail to give you an idea of how it applies to the others. Karl Marx thought it was this thing that the elites invented to keep poor people in check, to keep them under control. Historically, that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. If we look at how religions develop and evolve over time and have developed and evolved in various cultures, we can find that he was just wrong. The other thing that's interesting is that during slavery, there have been several fairly good studies of religion in the antebellum South during slavery. And one of the interesting things they discovered is that the white slave masters really tried to use it as the opioid of the masses. They wanted it to be that, and they used it exactly the way Marx would suggest. Here we have the theft of labor, and we have a bunch of white slave owners trying to use religion as the opioid of the masses. And so this would support Marx's theory. The problem is the black slaves who they were trying to control with religion were not entirely stupid, because that's what you'd have to be controlled by this, and they were not. They were smart, intelligent people, and they actually heard the stories of their religion, and one of the stories they heard was Moses. Set my people free, and dang it, out of that grew this whole liberation theology, and for them it was very much not the opioid of the masses. It was a ferment of rebellion. And so it did not function the way either the slave owners hoped or the way Marx predicted it was even for or would function. It functioned in the opposite way. So you can see both how his definition of religion and then the way he studied it, based on that definition, creates a hypothesis. We can also then see how the hypothesis is tested by the data of what actually happened in the slaveholding South. And then we can see how you can rule out a hypothesis. But notice that even while ruling it out, it still provides insight. In this case, it provides insight on how the white slaveholders tried to use religion as the opiate of masses, and we can then ask questions about why it failed. And so my point is, even when these people are wrong, sometimes using the lens they created for us to view religion can still be enlightening and helpful. Rodney William Starks created this rational choice theory. Again, I'm not going to go through these in detail. These are the sorts of things, if you're interested in religious studies, these are the people you'll learn about and some of the theories you'll learn about. From psychology, we have William James, who created, this is the one I'm going to talk about, I hope, at the next class. He created an entire philosophical movement called pragmatism, which was largely to justify his belief in God, his continued faith and belief in God, among other things. But he also collected what we call the varieties of religious experience. It's just a really dry textbook full of his interviews with people who had religious experiences. And he wanted to collect the variety of religious experience. So he's thought of it as a psychological thing that people feel, and he wanted to collect all the different experiences people had psychologically in their religious mode. He was a believer, of course. Sigmund Freud was a non-believer, so he thought religion was a group neurosis. Carl Gustav Jung was his student who disagreed entirely. He thought it was a psychological manifestation of repressed things that was not entirely bad, including several archetypes. The only way the repressed psychology could get out was to express itself symbolically, and there were these fundamental human archetypes that every culture expressed. We call this parallelomania. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this is the problem where you see parallels everywhere and you just kind of invent connections even when they're not there. But that doesn't mean there's no benefit to some of the work he did. Jonathan Haidt is a modern psychologist who is researching moral theory, why people believe what they do about what's right and wrong. Where does their moral psychology come from, and why does that cause us so much conflict with each other? So why good people are divided by religion and politics is the sources book. Very good book. I highly recommend that, by the way, if you're going to read something. We have Emil Durkheim, who thought religion was a way for people to express themselves to themselves or define themselves to themselves, much like a sports mascot. Of course, the problem with his definition is it's no different than a sports team. They have mascots too. But he at least showed us the cultural group effect of religion, the identity aspect. Here we are, Unitarian Universalists, and if that becomes part of your identity and you have a chalice that represents that identity, you wear it proudly and it becomes part of who you are and defines you against them, the other tribes. He kind of brought this to mind in very stark ways. Evolutionary biology, of course, we have Richard Dawkins, who thinks that religion is a mimetic virus. He's clearly not wrong that it's a mimetic thing that evolves over time and spreads from person to person, infects our minds. It's just not so clear that it's always a virus. Some other people have pointed out that religion can be a mimetic symbiote as well as a mimetic virus. And there's one of the ways a religion can survive is by helping its people do better. Because if it helps its people do better, it'll survive better, and therefore that's one way religion can survive, and so it becomes a mimetic symbiote. Another way it can survive is by being so virulent that it eventually causes the people in the cult to kill themselves. So that happens all the time in these mass suicides, not all the time, but it happens, right? So the point is, Richard Dawkins is not wrong. It can be a evolutionary or mimetic parasite, but he's also wrong in the sense that that's not all it can be. It can also be a religious symbiote. It just depends on the type of religion you engage in. But again, this is one of our new atheists, so this is obviously why he sees it the way he does. The problem with all these approaches is that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I would propose, when we study religious studies, I'm going to show you in the classes, if you come, for example, if you come next time, we'll do William James. I'm going to show you one approach to religion. It's very useful, but you get the tendency, you get in the habit of using it for everything. Religion is just a psychological phenomenon in the mind, and therefore, if we collect the varieties of human experience, we've seen all we need to see of religion. Or religion is just a totem, with a group psychology like a sports team, group identity. Well, now we've seen everything we need to see about religion again. It seems to me that when we apply all of these approaches and see them all together, we sort of get the best view of what this kind of fuzzy, weird thing that we call religion actually is. The other thing to obviously be very careful about, especially in comparative religion, which is important for me because I began teaching religion, teaching a class called Temples and Texts, done by Stephen Ricks, who's one of the coolest guys I've ever met. He had a stroke, unfortunately, and it really kind of curtailed his teaching ability and also some of his intelligence. But before that, the man was brilliant, and he knew many, many different ancient languages, and he was very smart. But his class was all about temples and temple rituals all around the world, and I co-taught that class with him. And I built all his slides for him. I was never listed on the course catalog, right? Yeah, he was the teacher, but I ended up teaching more than 50% of the lectures. The problem with all those lectures, going back and looking at them, is that I was engaged primarily, and so was he, in parallelomania. Right? We see parallels and similarities everywhere, and we think we found something profound, either about the nature of human psychology. And there is profound stuff in the similarities of all the different religions do some things that are the same. And why do they all do the same thing? Well, that must tell us something about what it means to be human, because we all have that same yearning. And so when we invent a religion, we all invent something similar. There's something profound in that. We just have to be very careful about our methodology, because otherwise we tend to see parallels in superficial things and think they're somehow fundamental. And we misunderstand deeply the religious traditions we're studying. And we also think we've found some underlying, truth that may not be there. So parallelomania and everything looks like, and when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Those are the two things to be careful of. All right, so to conclude, again, most of the time I try to show people what other people are doing and to understand it, but I kind of want to give my own take. One of the problems with it, and why we have this hammer-nail problem, is what we call reductionism. And it's not that everything in the world doesn't, reduce to quantum mechanics at some level. It's that when you think quantum mechanics is therefore all you need, you end up with these myopic views of religion. Like Sigmund Freud's view and Karl Marx's view is myopic. And they miss the great cathedral around them because they're busy looking at this one stone and they think that stone is all there is. And so one approach to avoiding reductionism was done by, and I've heard his name said 1,000 times, and every time I say it wrong, so I'm not going to try. His first name, I never get it right. But Eliade, Richard Eliade, I think, is the right way to say that, but I always get that wrong for some reason. His approach to avoiding reductionism was to assume that there was actually something in the world called the holy, the sacred, and that people were sensing it somehow. Like with a sixth sense, you can sense it when you're in the presence of the holy, and that holy thing is a real thing. Whereas, like a psychologist would say, no, it's a psychological condition that all humans have this experience, just like we all see beauty. It's a psychological thing. Well, is beauty an actual thing, or is it just a psychological thing? This is the philosophical debate. And so for him, religion, the holy, was this thing that we all sense and feel, and that explains why there are similarities. So he spent forever doing parallelomania stuff, trying to find all the things that people thought were holy and how they felt, how they created and constructed this sensation of holy, because he thought he was finding how people react to some real thing out in the world. This proved unpopular both for Christian religious people and also atheists, right? Because the atheists are like, no, there's no such thing. It's a psychological phenomenon. And the Christians were like, yeah, I think the holy exists, but I don't think that pagan person was actually experiencing it. And so neither group really liked this approach. But for those of us like the Unitarian Universalists who like to see truth in all the different religious traditions of the world, we tend to like it. On the other hand, I don't think it's necessary. Again, what I'm going to propose is kind of an agnostic, instead of a methodological atheism, I'm going to propose methodological agnosticism. It's not necessary to believe or disbelieve that there's a real holy thing out there that all these different groups are touching. It could be some real holy thing in the world if you think that we're all touching, through some sixth sense, or it could be some psychological reaction that we all share because we're all human. And what I propose is that as a scientist, it doesn't matter. This isn't the solution to reductionism in my mind, to assume that there's a real category. That doesn't actually solve the problem. The best way to get out of reductionism is to talk about what we call emergent levels of an explanation. Again, this is exactly like, everything's quantum mechanics, but if you tried to study chemistry using quantum mechanics, you really don't get very far because it's too complicated. So instead, we have these simplified rules of how elements combine and connect to form molecules. We call that chemistry. And then, those things do combine into molecular biology. Molecular biology is just chemistry, but if you study it at the level of chemistry, you don't get very far. And cell biology is also just quantum mechanics, but if you study it at that level, you don't get very far. So at each level, we can create our own methodology, our own techniques for studying it, and we study it as a thing in and of itself. And so this is my pitch for why we can study religion as a thing in and of itself, even if its definitions are fuzzy, even if it is made up of many components like psychology and sociology and political science, and all of these things combined are all part of it. It still is worthy of study at its own level and in its own right, because it is one of the most interesting things that people do. And we can use science to study what people do. And we call that a soft science, right? And there are challenges when we do that, but they are not insurmountable. We just have to be very careful with our methodology, and we also have to be epistemically humble when we try to come to conclusions, because this isn't the sort of thing where experiments are easily repeatable. It's easy to make mistakes, but no less interesting in all of that. One last comment. Where the heck are the women in all of this? Because every person I've just mentioned is a dude. And that's an obviously good question to ask. And I think, in fact, it was asked at the end of my faith and science talk, and I really should have just brought it up in the main talk, and I didn't. It was a chapter that I left out, and I shouldn't have, because I think it's actually pretty important. Anthropology is the element used to study religion, where people kind of wander into tribes and they try to talk to people and get them to tell them their myths and their beliefs, right? These are called field studies. And the anthropologists realized probably, and this doesn't mean the anthropologists have solved the problem of sexism. There's all sorts of sexist anthropologists. That's not the point. The anthropologists, though, recognized the problem that an all-male faculty was creating for their field before most, in fact, of the other fields in the world. And the reason for that is because they realized very quickly that it led to bad science. Because what would happen is a dude would walk into a tribe and ask them about the rituals, and they'd let him into the men's tent, and the men would tell him about the rituals, and then he'd ask to go chat with the women, and they'd be like, no. Right? And so there actually are a large number of female anthropologists that are fairly famous and influential. This is a short list I pulled from Wikipedia. Why did I not list any of them? Well, because when we're talking about the foundations, we're talking about a history that was deeply sexist. And so historically, the history of religious studies was written by men, and that is a problem because women are religious too. And if we don't get their view and they don't get their voice, the result in this instance is just plain bad science. Eliade has a famous story where one of his PhD students was a woman, and she came to him and said, what should I study? And he said, you should do women's studies and religious studies. And she said, no, I want to do something important. And he looked at her like she was crazy. Because this is important, and this is the big problem with sexism. Even it can contaminate even women in our culture to where we don't realize our own value, their own value. And so he said, no, this is probably the most important and impactful thing you will ever do. And so again, we have not. That doesn't mean religious studies has solved the problem of sexism. We have not. But I think that in this field especially, it's especially obvious why it's a really big problem for us and why we're working to solve it. This is my absolute favorite religious study. And yes, it's niche because I'm Mormon and I get it, right? But let me tell you what she did. It's maybe ironic that the history of religious study was all men, but my favorite study in religion was done by a woman. What she did is she went out and she found, as best she could, a representative sample of Mormons. Very hard to do, by the way, because if you just say, if you're Mormon, come talk to me, then you end up with a snowball sample and it's not representative. But she found, to the best of her ability, a representative sample of Mormons, and then she looked at the differences of beliefs of the millennial Mormons versus the older generation in survey data. And her point was, this is how Mormonism is changing, and it is changing to be more LGBT inclusive, to be less certain about its beliefs, and all sorts of things that we would at least, I think, consider to be good. But she showed that it is changing, and that the leadership of the church, which is trying to pull it the other direction, is failing to do so. Their own members don't believe the same things that the leaders tell them to believe. Very good. What she did that was so brilliant was she did the survey data, so it was quantitative, and then she did individual qualitative interviews with individuals from her survey group. So you got the numbers, but then you also got a person's voice telling you why they feel the way they do. And it personalized it. And that deep personal approach, I think, is what made it so great. Lots of people have done these surveys. She did something better. And her book is just phenomenal. And this is the sort of study that we should be encouraging all around the world, because this is the sort of thing that really leads to insight. It's quantitative, it's scientific, and it's qualitative, and it tells you why, because each of these people who make up a data point are a person with a real life and belief, and she brought those personal experiences to life. Very good stuff. If you're interested in more of this stuff, come to my class. If you're interested in just listening on your own, a lot of what I did today on the history of religious studies is from this book and the great courses, An Introduction to the Study of Religion. Very good. He's got one 30-minute lecture on kind of each of these people and like 20 more that I didn't cover, and the contributions they made to the field and where they came from, et cetera. So again, I highly recommend that if you're interested in kind of studying this more on your own. Thank you so much for inviting me. Every time I come to speak, I feel like It's a bit of an honor, and it's a responsibility to try to say something that actually helps you on your life's journey in your responsible search for truth and meaning. And I hope I do a good job of that. And I know sometimes I fail, but I'm always trying. And thank you for letting me talk to you about something that I find fascinating, so fascinating that I might push it and talk about it when other people would like to talk about something else. And so thank you for letting me talk about my pet topic for 35 minutes. And thank you.